just this whole, I'm really excited about this week, and mostly for all the faces I see. It's just so wonderful to see so many of you and know that you'll be connected together. This whole, I've had personally, I know you, some of the stories you're just beginning to unpack as you were listing some of those questions you've been asked in interviews. It's been an important part of my own journey, because when I was in this midlife moment trying to figure out what was next, and I had never sought capital before. I didn't know how to take on or even seek an investor in the scaling work of WiLD Leaders. And I started to be in conversation. I had one conversation I went in, is this man who ended up becoming very quickly a mentor of mine. And I just was trying to seek some business advice. And this was his name was Frank Haas. And Frank was from my perspective, a pretty scary guy, a Navy pilot who'd flown in combat. He was a business person and had tremendous wisdom and knowledge. I knew so many people who had been impacted by him. And so I went into a meeting with him, my first meeting, and I had a stack of the tools in the WiLD toolkit. So I brought the product, if you will, like printed out. I had a pro forma and a budget and a balance sheet, and he had a copy of my book sitting on top of this stack. I don't think he ever read any of this stuff, by the way. So he had this sitting on his dining room table. I walk in, I'm just trying to get advice, and thinking we're going to talk finance, we're going to talk business, and the first thing he says to me, I got one question for you, Rob. Is Rob ready for a change? And I'm just, and it just blew my mind, because it was the last thing I thought Frank would say to me. And so then I'm thinking, okay, this is not going to go as I planned. But I knew it was the right question. What was interesting is I assumed that Frank knew the right answer. I assumed it was a test question, that he wanted me to say yes. I thought that's what he meant. And so then I went away. I left. I didn't answer the question there. I thought about it, and I came back and I said, Frank, not only am I ready for a change, like something has to change. I'm at this point where I feel like the question you asked has just been haunting me. And yes, I'm ready. But I thought I found out long after that question was asked, that he didn't know the answer to the question he was asking me. And I assumed he did. And then he said this to me. He said, okay, here's my next question. Now I'm thinking, okay, now we're going to get down to the business stuff. This is what he said. Have you talked to your wife yet? And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to a therapist. I'm here for business advice, but it was all the right questions. And so it's something that's deeply personal and meaningful to me. But let's get into like the concept of this idea of questions, because I truly see this, and our team sees this. This is why we call this a whole leader reformation, is that part of this is reforming our paradigm. So if we're going to reform the way that we actually think about preparing the next, or reforming leadership, means reforming how we think about developing leaders as well. Because when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about human beings, people who are leaders, and that's sort of our radical focus is on the one. And one of the things that is so interesting, and there are other just amazing people who have written about this, is that so much of the power of development happens outside of answers. Let me give you one way to think about this. I'm going to use my high-tech app many of you are getting used to and have seen many times. But one way to think about this is that so many of us have this aspiration for this ideal self, whatever it is, whether it's business-related, mission-related, health-related, of this ideal place we would like to be. And the paradigm of our world is that when it comes to the space between, when I describe our tactical self, what I mean is kind of how we're actually functioning. And that we see ourselves as this looking across this chasm and seeing that there's this distance between where I currently am, how I'm functioning, and who I would like to be, or how I would like to be, or the kind of leader I would like to become. And here's what I want to suggest to you, is that this is part of our wiring, but it's only part of it. What I want to suggest to you, and here I'm going to draw in real time, here's my interactive part of my app, is that when it comes to developing a whole leader, is that what's really important is the questions that are in that gap. And that the answers sometimes are important, but it's the questions that we ask that are probably, and maybe even more important to our development and growth than are the answers. But I'm not dismissing the answers. I just want to think about this, that what does it mean to open up questions as much as we do answers? Because there's something, we talk about having people own their development, but their development occurs in questions that we would open up for them, or that we would just maybe help them open up for themselves. So at an individual level, this is one way to think about it. At an organizational level, it's also interesting because Dan and I were working with a senior leader a couple of years ago who was about to introduce WiLD leaders, and this was to a couple thousand people in his organization. So it was a big moment for us. And he said, okay, when I set this up, before you guys come up, what I'm going to say to people in the room is everyone in this room should be investing in the development of leaders around you. And we're sitting there going, okay, can we just tinker with your statement just a little bit and change it? And one of the reasons this was important to us is, by the way, no one wants to be should have. Like, very rarely has should ever motivated anyone to do much of anything. But the second thing was this: we were hoping he would ask a question, and this is what we sort of nudged him toward: was would you reframe that just a little bit? Same content, different way of approaching it, and say this: what would change if you and everyone in this room were intentionally investing in the leaders around you? And that's what was interesting about that, is that now everyone in the room is thinking it's an invitation as opposed to a proclamation, which makes it very, very different. So it's been interesting too, as we have kind of been into this process of questioning, because so many people on our team, we're psychologists, and so assessment is a part of what we do. Questioning and solid questions and question construction is important. And when we built the WiLD toolkit as a developmental system and process, it was designed to provide some structure and measures of progress, and also some typing or handholds for your development, some labels. But a lot of it, much, at least half of it, was actually creating a narrative. And one of the things that we were intentional about was thinking about the way that we structured questions inside the toolkit. Is what's made the toolkit so radically different in terms of what other people have experienced, is that your development occurs as someone involved in leader development, and for myself and for so many other people, it happens long before you get the answer about your spirit animal. I'm just using that as kind of, or whatever typology you receive. So, like, you know what I mean? Where you use some sort of assessment bank, and then it spits out this magical thing that says, oh, this is who you are. And you go, oh, that sounds a lot like me. And so it has this high face validity. But the reality is that your development occurred. And by the way, clinical psychologists are very, very well aware of this, that actually the process of intervention from a clinical psychologist perspective happens as soon as you make the appointment. Like, think about that for a second. Like, as soon as, because you have expressed on your own side of it intention to change. And one thing that I've always felt responsible for is the way that I ask questions. In my dissertation, I used one of the most validated assessments out there of general well-being. Like, you're supposed to use validated assessments. This is a question that's in my dissertation that I will never ask someone ever again. And the question was this: in the last 6 months, how often have you been anxious, worried, or upset? And then it left it there. Do you know what haunts me to this day is that without what I have just prompted in a person, I'm not saying it's not an important question, but it needs some structure around it, because what I've caused a person to do is, yeah, I am pretty anxious. I am pretty worried. And so we have to be thinking intentionally about the questions we ask. So when we built the WiLD toolkit, one of the things that there were a couple of rules that I sort of tripped into this concept of questions as development was, one was do no harm, because we weren't sure that a coach was going to be there to unpack some of the questions, but also be appreciative and leave people in a better place than where you started with them. So in that process, what I realized what was happening over the years of developing the system of questions with some scaffolding and structure for whole leader development was that actually something else was happening, that it was opening up agency for people. We started to see that people were even who had been to every airport seminar, because the question process in relationship, when it got into a conversation with the rest of their team, was actually opening up even people who were resistant to change, because they had never been invited into their own development, like truly invited in. They've been told, given a label, felt like things are a test, had looked over their shoulder by their organization. And so it was so amazing to watch what we describe as developmental mental efficacy opening up in a person, simply because of the way we ask questions. So it's fascinating, because it's become a lot of the kind of the framework for much of what we do. And I would say to you also, please always hear, I am very much a supporter of the idea that most things occupy a paradoxical space with us. In other words, I think answers sometimes are important. I am actually, and the team knows this, like sometimes I just need to be told what to do. So I am not minimizing the power of answers, but I think when answers are provided in the absence of certain kinds of questions, that becomes a little bit, that's missing something. And it's also, to be honest with you, it's a little bit lazy. And I gotta say that I think one of the things that's interesting is that we become developmentally lazy, because the real questions that we talk about over a cup of coffee or a beer with a friend, we're having these conversations somewhere. Get into some wild space and frontier. If you know what I mean, where some scaffolding and some structure would be really helpful if we're going to build intention around development. And so, so I want to give you, before we launch into our conversations, I want to give you what old Dr. Halleck and I would describe as the paradoxical anatomy of a wild question. Are you with me? I can't see you right now because I'm looking there, but I'm going to have a lot of head nods. I'm hoping Kim Armstrong is going like, let's go, Rob, let's go. So I want to give you what Daniel and I have thought through with this, and Megan chimed in yesterday. We were thinking through this and doing some writing about this. Here are some things, and it's a paradoxical anatomy of a wild question. So here's the first thing, that a wild question, when I say wild, sure, it's our brand, it's what we do. A whole and intentional leader development question is what I mean by this, but it's a question that is a little bit wild. It's the question where someone asks you to go, that's kind of wild. So here's the first thing. It's invitational and directional. So it's a question that invites you into your own development, invites you into the possibility that you could actually answer something, but it has a structure and a direction. So it's got an area maybe of focus, and it's kind of interesting. Like I have lots of examples. We have decks of cards. This is our wild card deck. Imagine a whole deck of just wild cards. And it's interesting. Like one of the questions is, how would your perspective be different if you believed others could change? Let me just stop. How would your perspective be different if you believed others could change? This is like 50 of these kinds of questions. So it's invitational, but it has a direction in terms, there is a research-based direction behind that question, based in personality and context, like how development occurs. That's the first thing, invitational and directional. So it invites you in, but it has a direction. The second thing, listen to this. It is unknown and answerable. That's the paradox. So I didn't realize when Frank asked me, is Rob ready for a change? He didn't know the answer. And it is very different than something that's sort of where I ask you a question, but I really know what the answer is. You know, where I'm not, it's more of a test question. Do you have it right? As opposed to, it really is, the person is open to the possibility. So it's unknown by me and it's unknown by them, but it's answerable. But it might take peeling back that onion just a little bit. So it's unknown and answerable. The third thing, this makes it a wild question, is because it's part of our own, I will say this, part of our value system, that it is both selfish and selfless. So a wild question for us has to involve both you and a building up of who you are, if I'm asking you a question, but it also has to have either explicitly or implicitly a connection into others. So that's the paradox, is it's both and. We need to build up our own efficacy and competence through the questions we ask others and are asking ourselves, or asking other people are asking us. But it's also for the sake of also, not just for us, but also for the other people in whom we're invested. The next thing, so it's selfish and selfless, rigorous and human, okay? And this is a deep value of ours. We actually believe that there's research could show us something. So there's this amazing body of books and research, really smart scientists and work that we've had a chance to be a part of that actually tells the story of what leaders experience and what employees and people in organizations experience. And so for us, it needs to be grounded in some of that whole leader development research and work with a solid scientific background, but also human and personal. That it actually gets at the reality that each one of us has both brokenness and beauty. That if we miss that part of the equation of what it means to be human, that it's the science isn't enough. That's why, the heart and science is something that's really important to us. So rigorous and human. The next thing, and I got just a couple more, aspirational and actionable. That space between your tactical self and your ideal self is an aspiration. Just like our fairly wonderful Constitution in the United States, or in India, by the way, these are aspirational documents. These are documents that invite us into questions that we have not achieved. But the questions that we ask that are wild questions are questions that actually have aspiration for something I haven't seen yet, but I could take action in specific kinds of ways. And then finally, this is it. And Daniel already gave a nod to this. They are appreciative and disruptive in the same moment. So they have a side of them that will always open up something positive for a person, but they don't avoid the disruption. And they may cause us to kind of pause and say like, oh man. And so it's an interesting thing about a question that's both appreciative and disruptive. And I would say that finally, I would say this before you talk a little bit about this, about what the wild questions look like. And I know that these are being put into the chat as we go. And but here would be my litmus test for a wild question, because it doesn't have to satisfy everything. It's a lot of work to do, but you'll take away and you'll go think about it, is this. It's the question you ask someone at a party, and they, instead of just kind of having the same conversation, it causes pause. Usually they kind of, Dan and I have talked about that, they kind of look up or they look down or they kind of look away and they go, that's a good question. And if someone says, that's a good question, it's almost like there's a question after the, that's a good question, that it opens up that would be our litmus test for what that looks like. So as you get into these questions, let's talk more about this, and Daniel, take it away.